Okay. Hi, everybody. There's actually a lot of new faces to me on this. I know some of you are regulars to Jeremy's programs, and so I hope you enjoy learning from me today and consider also attending some of my programs. So hopefully I get to reel you in, but as Jeremy said, I am currently still in a MA program for sociology at UNO, and I am minoring in religion, and my undergrad background is in religion with a minor in sociology. So just basically flip those, and Jeremy and I were discussing different topics about what we can teach about, and we decided, let's throw in sociology, let's throw in psychology, let's throw in all these different things that people don't often think about in connection with religion. So this is going to be kind of participatory. I will do some teaching, but then I will also, thank you, Wendy, for saying the Valerie event for me. It's going to be some teaching, but it's also going to give you all an opportunity to engage, and I pose some questions to you all during the entire program. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for the presentation, and we will begin. Everybody, unless you're talking, if everybody can hit mute on their Zoom, that would be great. Okay, so your syllabus for the evening. We're going to go over the background on the development of the field of sociology, why study religion through a sociological lens, what don't you see in the textbooks, and then general questions from you all after the presentation. This is, only an hour and a half, and I really want some discussion. So obviously I can't cover the whole field of the sociology of religion. That's at least a semester-long course, and also a whole PhD program. So we're only going to get some really basic information, and I do provide you with a lot of different resources at the end. So, and I will also follow up with an email with some other resources as well. So the development of sociology really started during the age of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, as a result of, philosophers asking why. Why do we do these things? How do we understand things better? So in 1838, Auguste Comte reinvented the term sociology. And then other theorists and philosophers, and later people who became known as sociologists, started developing within the field. So that main development of sociology as an academic field of study really started within the 17th and 18th centuries, and was really developed by people like Karl Marx, who happens to be one of my favorites. I won't dance around that. He is my favorite. Herbert Spencer, Zimmel, a bunch of different folks. And I do want to call our attention to the where sociology and anthropology kind of a difficult history with that. So it's important for me to note to you all that the field of sociology and anthropology are born out of a white supremacist framework, which placed European societies above those of indigenous societies, and often cited those communities as primitive. And as an extension, those indigenous religions were also seen as less evolved, which influences why and how the spread of Christianity in particular is connected to white supremacy. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to challenge you as learners and people within our society to think about how academic fields of study have been developed, and who does that development, and then also how do we find out about certain researchers and philosophers and sociologists. So I'd like to plant that seed in everybody's head. So if the purpose of sociology is to ask the questions of why do we engage in society in the ways that we do? Why do you all think that it's important, or even if it is important, to have the subfield of the sociology of religion? Feel free to either say something in the chat or out loud. I hear somebody typing, I think. Anybody want to go? So Jeremy says that there's something deeply human about communities. And Kale, yes. And so Kale's answering the next question of what is the difference of studying theology and the sociology of religion, and that theology is what we believe and sociology is the why. It's important to explore common belief systems. The society side of religion is critically important in many theologies. Great, yes. Sociology looks at the human interaction rather than the spiritual aspects. I agree with that generally, but as the presentation goes along, there's going to be a little bit of pushback to that. So let's move on. So why even study the sociology of religion? So for me, it's really intellectually exciting. And so when I first wrote that on there, I was like, oh my God, Amanda, you're such a nerd. And I am. And so I did that little graphic for you all to kind of just prepare yourself, because I'm gonna nerd out. But it also allows us to question our own internal beliefs and how we function, not only as religious communities, but how religions impact our secular society. The sociology of religion provides us that opportunity to learn about the other. And at Tri-Faith, that's really important to us. That's why we're even here on this shared commons. And then it allows us to look at how religions are practiced in the US and then how they are practiced around different societies. So because I study a lot of mainly Judaism, you can look at how American Judaism is different from in Europe, in the UK, and in Israel, right? So you can see how those different societies have impacted how Judaism is practiced. And then ultimately, the sociology of religion is about people. We are the representatives of the world's many religions, and how we impact that through our belief or actions, not just belief, impacts society, and society impacts us. So what do you think is left out of many of the sociology textbooks or mentioned only in passing? This is calling us back to that original question that I wanted to pose to you all about how sociology was developed and typically how other academic fields were developed. So also feel free to put that in the chat, or you can verbally say something. You can also ask for more clarification. What do you mean by tiny groups, Jeremy?
Like little population groups that are that are deemed too small to look at.
Okay, so that's the actual subject matter within the textbook, you're saying, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Other cultural perspectives besides white Christian perspectives, yes. Religion is typically minimized in most social studies textbooks, K through 12, including sociology, absolutely. And that, you know, there's that misconception that we can't have religion in public schools. However, we 100% can teach about different world religions within our public school system. And I actively encourage that. And UNO, the Religious Studies Department, has had an ongoing relationship with OPS. It's kind of changing right now due to faculty changes, but where students can earn dual credit by taking a world religions course. So I think it should absolutely be there. And okay, yeah, and religion in general may be or may not be left out of sociology. And that is a good point, because religion has kind of been othered within the field of sociology, even though I think it's mainly because a misconception of what is studying religion in general. And then also, going to be a little honest here, a little blunt, about thinking about who has the best way of looking at society, right? Like, is it psychologists who have the best research methods? Is it historians that have the best research methods? Is it sociologists? So I would also generally agree with that statement. So instead of going into a bunch of different theorists and sociologists, other than Marx, W.E.B. Du Bois is also one of my favorite sociologists. And I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of him, but maybe don't know a lot about him. So W.E.B. Du Bois was a lot of different things. He was a civil rights activist. He was a sociologist, an educator. I think the most fascinating thing about him is that he was a poet as well. And he brought a lot of different ways of looking at society to the forefront of the field. And he is often just touched on unless you are doing intentional work and study around race and ethnicity. So in my own study of sociology, I don't remember, other than a theory course and a specific race and ethnicity course, where we talked about him in depth. And so that's what I want to highlight for you. And the other important thing that I find about him is that he is one of the founders of the NAACP, and was really pivotal in elevating Black folks during the late 1800s and early 1900s. He did, after a lot of time, obviously, in the US, because he was born here, he ended up moving to Africa, and he died in Ghana, which is just an interesting thing, because he talks about how can Black Americans survive in the United States? And ultimately, he felt the need to have to leave the United States and return to the home continent of his people, even though he wasn't originally from there. Much of Du Bois' works were focused on highlighting the Black intellect and race theory. So Du Bois' work rested in liberation from white supremacy and capitalism. And one of the most notable theories of his is the theory on consciousness. And that is highlighted and discussed in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. And so I want us to think about how academics and theorists talk about text, and how they talk and disseminate that information to the reader. So what do you imagine when you think of academic text? How is that communicated to the reader? What is the tone that the theorist uses? And then what is the type of language that the theorist uses? Yes, they tend to see theory as factual and trying to prove their case. Seems like usually they are very distant from the reader. Jargon, yes. We use the language is academic, yep. Dry. Yeah, objective, which can cover bias, absolutely. And for the everyday person, it's hard to understand. Generally, textbooks are a little arrogant in tone and distant. Yes, I think that that is a very good observation. Anybody else want to add some things? So the next few slides, I'm going to show, they're not specific necessarily to religion, but I want to show just how creative and innovative Du Bois was in his work. And the slides that I'm going to show you, I literally just found out about in November. And I was sitting in a room full of sociologists who study religion, and I was presenting a paper on Du Bois, and another one of the presenters talks about him as a poet and as an artist and as an academic, and she was the one who highlighted these incredible graphs. So this generally looks like it would be kind of maybe like a bar graph, but he's showing just different visuals of this data. So this is the proportion of freemen and slaves among Black Americans. And so you see that he really, instead of having free folks being the good thing, right, where it shows like it, instead of it, the green, good, right, it's very, very small. And then enslaved, Black, that's showing that like this disparity is just so large. This is assessed valuation of households and kitchen furniture owned by Black Georgians. And so it goes, these are kind of hard to see, so I'll individually link them in the follow-up email, but it goes by income levels and years, and he uses this spiral method as opposed to just a straight bar graph or line. And then this one, it is very blurry, but this is about how many Black people lived in certain communities by population size. So this line right here is actually for larger cities, and then medium-sized cities, and then maybe large towns, and then this is the amount of people in the late 1800s that lived in rural populations, primarily in Georgia. And then this is probably my favorite graph because it shows how each instance that he's tracking feeds into the next. And so it shows that by having the spikes go inward, and that they're carrying each of the colors with them that represent the different lines, the different data points. And another thing that I want to show, can you all see this part too? Just making sure. Okay, great, thank you. So in the Souls of Black Folk, he starts each chapter, there's 13 chapters, with a poem and then a Black spiritual tune. And so this first one that opens the whole book is, "O water, voice of my heart, crying in the sand, all night long crying with a mournful cry, as I lie and listen and cannot understand the voice of my heart in my side, or the voice of the sea. O water crying for rest, is it I, is it I? All night long the water is crying to me. Unresting water, there shall never be rest, till the last moon droop and the last tide fail, and the fire of the end begin to burn in the west, and the heart shall be weary and wander and cry like the sea, all life long crying without avail, as the water all night long is crying for me." So these poems at the beginning are actually written by white folks, and he wanted to show the same level of intellect between Black people and white people. And then he does that with every one of the chapters, which I think is really beautiful. And in case you didn't know, he and Booker T. Washington had quite the feud. And they really believed in two separate ideologies. So Booker T. Washington believed that Black Americans really needed to become integrated within the society. There was a certain level of respectability politics with his work, to where you have to show that you are educated, that you are. One of the still racist things that people say to people of color is that you're so articulate. And so things like that. So Booker T. Washington, in my view, associated with that, and Du Bois pushed against that and said that Black folks need to have their own space. They need to be able to communicate in the ways that they need to communicate. And ultimately, they need to be accepted for that. So we're going to, and the next thing is about tone and language. So he was really, really a poet, as I said. And this next clip is a section of the book, and we will listen to it. So if verbally you guys can participate in this next part, can you kind of just tell me what you felt when you listened to that passage or when you saw those graphs? And I can go back in the presentation if you would like. I'm really good at sitting in silence.
This graph that you have up right now, I mean, it just says violence to me. You know, it just looks like knives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
You know, I was going to say, can you hear me?
Yep.
What I was going to say is back a couple of slides where the comment was made of the Black people under supremacy, under white supremacy for so many years, developed that consciousness, and were almost labeled as non-human beings. And and then you were showing like their music and the poetry and everything. It reflected the struggle of both in that 1800s, the 1900s, and it's going on today too, as it wells up. Mm-hmm. The racism wells up in our society, that struggle between white supremacy and the Black culture. And, you know, there at one point too, we were talking about, do they be integrated or are they separate? Mm-hmm. And that has been a struggle too with, you know, with the whole school situation where we integrated them. Now we're back at separatism with a lot of the school situations across the country. So it just reflects the American culture, both religiously and socially, that we continue to struggle with this.
Yes. Yep. And I would just add that it was that at this point in time that Black Americans were often seen as not people, right? That's
yeah.
Of slavery was used in a lot of issues, and we can also discuss about the use of Christianity as a justification for slavery, and also the use of Christianity as a reason to not support slavery, right? So there's that really big dichotomy there, I guess. And
well, I think, yeah, and I think as Christianity evolved in the United States at this time of slavery, Christianity stood by and let all this happen also, was part of that white supremacy to keep the black down. So churches were like that. They were segregated. They did not want, you know, they wanted the black people to have their own churches and the white people to have their own churches too. So religiously, we were separated also, I think. So Christianity was part of that, keeping the black as non-human down, because look how long it took for them to just get the right to vote.
And how that's the process of disenfranchisement is still there,
Right, yeah.
And that's why I like that video that I just showed you all, because it really connects Du Bois and situates him in the time period that he was in, but also brings us to the present.
Right. So your slides are just really historically showing a lot, I think, about, yeah, what we're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Did anybody catch the slight religious reference that was in this passage of how does it feel to be a problem?
I don't think.
It's still, they still are, quote, a problem.
Right, but there was a slight religious comment made in there that shows the connection between here, let me see if somebody said it in the chat or not.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just tell you. So in there, he makes the reference to the Israelites, right? And so that draws in the connection between Jews and Black people. And at that time, at that time, Jews were largely seen as non-white, correct? And so they were often on forms officially labeled as Black, because in the US, we only have Black and white as races. And then the rest of it are different ethnicities, right? So he's making that really deliberate choice to make that connection to Jews and the slavery that Jews went through and the slavery that Black folks went through. So I find that really fascinating, that that's something that has continued to permeate, because within Black churches, particularly, there's a lot of reference to Israelites and the struggle that the Israelites went through in Egypt. Let me check the chat real quick. Ooh, I like this comment from Alan. Often academics are talking about something they're studying objectively. The subject is other to them. Du Bois is studying and acknowledging that he is studying himself, even though he is by training and employment very different than the Black population in Georgia. That is absolutely correct. Cool, I'm gonna have to follow up with some of you people for my own research. Let's see. Okay, this is a really great question, Carrie. The feeling that he had there was that it's two things, right? Black and American, and that those two things don't go together because of how race was constructed in the U.S. And Carrie is wondering how prevalent that is today, and we'll get to that in a couple of slides. So. Well, at least I want you all to start thinking about that, and we'll discuss it in a couple of slides. Jews have felt and expressed that same tension between being American and Jewish. And Alan also poses that question of, is that less now? So and once again, in a couple of slides, I'll bring this all together. I'm not entirely sure, Alan, what that one, your question is, what is the reference? But I think that was the Israelite question. And so the way that the Souls of Black Folks starts off is saying that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And so that is the line that he represents as Black and then American and white. So this is a really, really brief video on the overview of the Souls of Black Folk, and they articulated it a lot better than I do. So how can W.E.B. Du Bois's work around race and ethnicity be used in the sociological study of religion? Hi, Martha.
Hello.
This is open for conversation. So, as I say on the actual slide, is that the intersection of race and religious identities is becoming an increasingly more popular subject among religious communities, but it's starting to emerge within the academic field as well. And so, particularly with the ongoing injustice around race and the disparities that continue to grow, that Du Bois is even more important, I believe, for us to reconnect with. And then also early in his career, he did do a lot of work around analyzing the experiences within the Black church. And it, like, I want to pose the question to you, why is it important for marginalized communities to have their own separate spaces as opposed to just being a part of the Black church, right? We can also see this within the Latino community of having very specific Spanish-speaking churches, whether they're Catholic, Pentecostal, mainline Protestant, they have that there are Korean churches as well that do all their services aimed at that population. Dr. Paul Williams is on this Zoom, and he has experience with, I believe, the Korean churches quite a bit. He can correct me if I'm wrong. The continued use of dog whistle language that is embraced by some contemporary politicians and their supporters. The genius of Du Bois is that the concept is also applicable to a variety of other communities, as some have pointed out in the chat. Yes. Code switching is a development out of this double consciousness, I believe, and that makes it so that people of marginalized identities, whether that is being a Black American, whether that's being a Latino, Jew to an extent, Muslims, we all go through a different type of code switching in order to fit the environment in which we are participating in. And so by code switching, I mean things like changing how you say words, changing your appearance to fit in with a society. So I think a really good example is whether or not curly hair or natural hairstyles are acceptable and deemed appropriate and professional for people of color. So that's some of the things that we experienced with code switching. And then, so how do you think that this could be applied to Judaism and Islam? This is kind of that question that I believe Alan was asking. If we think about what our picture of a Jew is, what comes to your mind? Where do we think, when we think about Judaism, where do we think that it is coming from people who immigrated here? And what is that viewpoint of Judaism, the standard that we associate with it, I guess? Yes, thank you, Jeremy. I talk about this a lot at work, and so he knows where I'm going with it. To a degree, yes, I am talking about physical standards. What is a stereotype of what a Jew looks like, whether it's curly hair, if they're of European descent, things like that. Would we get into stereotypes? Yeah, absolutely. And Pam, who decided Jews weren't white. So that was, that has a lot to do with class and being of a different religion than what was in the United States. So although we talk about freedom of religion a lot and that we're a secular society, Christianity has obviously impacted our society a lot. And then Italians and Irish weren't viewed as white either until they gained a certain level of economic stability and started to fit into that framework. And as other poorer communities came into the United States, they gained that condition, that whiteness. And I would argue that for Jews, it's a conditional whiteness that could be taken away at any point in time because marginalized folks aren't the ones in control of who gets to decide who is white and who is not white. Let's see. So yeah, so the, and with Islam, I think that we have this notion that most Muslims are Arab, right? But we know that Indonesia has the largest Muslim population. And so that kind of breaks up that stereotype of what we think of when we think of Muslims. In the last class, we talked about how for millennia, religion, race, ethnicity, tribe, and geographic location were all tied together. Only recently did they start shifting, but the effects persist. They have always been diverse. Yep, and same goes with Chinese and Asians. So let me see, what is my next slide? Okay, so I specifically do a lot of work around race and religion, and that's tying in both my sociological perspective as well as my religious studies perspective and my lived experience as a Latina Jew. And so I have done a lot of research connecting Du Bois' theory on double consciousness and how Jews of color perceive their own identity. So a lot of the stories from Jews of color is that within their community, whether it's the Black community, the Latino community, the Asian community, they're not seen as Jewish and they're an anomaly, right? We often think that Black folks and Latino folks in particular are Christian. For me, a lot of people make the assumption that I'm Catholic, which I'm not. So I'm constantly navigating that space with people who look like me. And then when I'm in the Jewish setting, whether that's Jewish communal life, professional life, or within a synagogue, I am having to show that my Judaism is legitimate. That because I don't look like the other Jews that are within this community, and there are very few Jews of color within this community, that I did find myself a lot of times code switching to fit in with the community. So one of the things that I did that was in retrospect kind of silly, but also because that pressure was being put on me, was that I started wearing my hair naturally curly. That, you know, there's that stereotype of when we envision a Jewish woman that she has curly hair. That's not true. Jews have all different types of hair. But I thought maybe if I could look a little bit more Jewish, then I would be able to fit in and people wouldn't constantly question whether I converted and if I converted for a husband or something like that. And then there are other stories, particularly within the Jewish community, for both Latinos and Black people about being seen as the help, that they are the ones that are the maintenance people within the synagogue. And so there's a lot of having to prove ourselves within the Jewish community that there are Jews of color, and there always have been Jews of color. And in fact, people of color are the people of the global majority. So when we rest our religious identities, whether conscious or unconscious, within a racial context, that others the actual people of color that are part of that religion. So yeah, so do you all have any questions? Have any thoughts about what I just said? I know that it is a little controversial within the mainstream Jewish community to have said some of those things that I just said. And it's also a reckoning with our own history as Jews in the civil rights movement and what we have typically seen as advocacy for Black folks. But that relationship is much more complicated and nuanced than our communal stories lead us to believe. Do you feel conflict between where your people come from and where your religion come from? That is not an offensive question. I would just say that, no, I don't. What I do feel at conflict with most of the time is those two separate identities and how they're lived in the United States. But I also want to call attention to immigration, Jewish immigration to Central and South America, and that Argentina has a large Jewish population. Well, it was large, it's not as large anymore. Mexico City has a population. And then just all across the line. So, and we know that Jews don't only come from European countries, that they were also in Spain. There's the Sephardi and there's the Mizrahi, right? That came from the Middle East and from Spain and Portugal and Morocco, right? So that those traditions have carried on. But a lot of those traditions, whether from Christianity or Islam, were forced to convert or flee their countries. Yes, Cuba also has a very large Jewish population, and Miami is one of the largest places with a Latino Jewish community. And interestingly enough, a lot of those Latino Jews in Florida tend to be a little bit more Orthodox as opposed to the more progressive movements. And as you could imagine, the places on the coast, whether it's New York or LA, have a larger percentage of Jews of color. Mm-hmm. Obviously, this is my field of study, so I could talk about Jews of color all day. Let me see. I feel like there's some connection between Islamophobia, stereotypes about race in Islam, and the discrimination that Sikhs receive in part due to Islamophobia. Yes, so there definitely is, because the practitioners of the Sikh faith are the ones that wear the turbans, and they are Southeast Asian, and they're often confused with being Muslim because of the stereotypes that we have around who is a Muslim and what does a Muslim look like and where do Muslims come from. And that's a really good plug for Valerie Kaur for her talk as well. She is also a Sikh activist and does a lot of work, civil rights work, and work against Islamophobia.
I was wondering what comments. I have a question. Mm-hmm. I'm third generation migration from Europe, from the migration from Europe, and I remember from my grandparents and mostly from my parents, and then myself, it seemed like at that time the population or the communities were more defined. And I'm wondering over my lifetime if now when I look at America, there's so much more integration of races, of religions, of values, and cultures. I don't know if anybody else that's a little bit older can attest to that, but I've seen a change from my childhood to now. We kind of all stayed in our German, Czech, Polish, Catholic, non-Catholic, our different neighborhoods. We stayed in our neighborhoods, and there wasn't much interracial marriage. It was starting in my mother's generation, but now I see that as very, we see that a lot. It's very common now. I don't know what anybody else thinks about that.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of points on that comment. So by the third generation away from the point of immigration, that is when a lot of the cultural ties to that home country are lost. So I'm actually third generation on my mother's side from Mexico. And for me, the way that my Mexican identity really manifests is in cultural things like food, right? However, I don't speak Spanish. And that is very, very common for third generation folks, is that their parents and their grandparents all speak their native language. However, that third generation often loses it. And part of that is largely due to assimilation and acculturation, right? And it also largely has to do with your proximity to whiteness, or the lack of that proximity to whiteness, right? So if you need to fit in order to survive, you're going to do survival coping mechanisms in order to do that. So the loss of those cultural ties feed into that. But I think we can also look, and the point about interracial marriages is that wasn't legal until the 60s. So it was across the United States it was illegal for a person of a different race or ethnicity to be married to a white person, or the reverse, a white person being married to a person of color. So we have a long, long history here with these dynamics. And and so Eric on our staff, he's our deputy director. He says, I'm also third generation away from my Salvadorian roots, and I have to really be intentional about not losing my connection completely. And he asked his mother to tell stories. Absolutely. Hashtag oral history. I also love oral history and ethnography. So take that, quantitative methodology, people. So yeah, how that manifests for me is to ask my grandma a lot of stories, but also we have that language barrier so that we don't communicate as effectively as we could in sharing those family stories.
Sociologically, that is an evolution of generations, also changes which affects changes in the country as a whole. Yeah, that's interesting from a sociological point of view. Yeah, with the migrations.
And I'm gonna go back up to that statement that Alan made about Du Bois and his work, and that typically academics and social scientists look at something that's objective. They're watching it from the outside, right? But he was very intentionally looking at it from the inside. And I can stop sharing the screen now. And we're finding that a lot more with academics of color as well. We are trying to navigate this academic space that is largely white and largely male, and has deep roots in bureaucracy, and who's in power and who can speak for a certain field. And so a lot of times we are researching ourselves. And so that's one of the things that I also do, obviously with my research with Latino Jews. Yeah.
It's interesting.
Anything else?
Am I muted?
Nope, you're on.
No, I'm okay. I'm sorry that I missed the beginning, but I've done a lot of soul searching and a lot of work doing cultural competence work and that sort of thing. And I just feel like we're hopefully moving in a direction where people are going to be recognized for who they are. And by that, I mean in all their complexity, rather than by what we see from the outside.
Mhm.
And I know that that's work that I guess, I think it's important to do. And I'm very happy that you have decided to study more deeply in terms of your own, who you really are, and how you came to be.
Mhm.
And I've been thinking a lot about that because as I'm getting older, I realize that my children do not really fully know my history. And I think that, and it's the same thing when my mom now has passed away. I'm going to be, I'm in my 80s. And so, I'm really thinking about what do I need to share before I'm gone and that history is lost. Because it's who, in a way, it's who they are too. And I was on another Zoom call earlier with a group of ladies, and one of the things that was talked about had to do with, how people work with each other. And thinking in terms of like sometimes young people don't want to work with older people, but a lot of times we have answers that they're not even aware of. But the answers could be different because we're in a different time. So I think that what I thought was interesting, my undergraduate's in psychology, and I remember thinking that our genes tell lots of stories. And, when we have children, we pass our genes on to them, but at the same time, then they develop more knowledge, more skills, a different way of being. And then when they have children, they pass it on to their children. So I started thinking, I've always thought as I watch little children today, that they're almost born smarter than we were. Does anybody else have that feeling? So I'm thinking, we cannot tell young people how to live things, because they have a different awareness and a different experience. And it's their world too, and they're moving forward. So I think that I was not aware of Dubois' work with this. So thank you, Amanda, for bringing this into my consciousness, because I knew about Dubois, but I didn't know really a lot about the work he did. So thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, anything else? And I do want to say that obviously I'm taking this from a very race theory perspective. And so maybe some other academics would push back on me saying that part of the reason why at least the third generation and on loses their connection to the native language is because of that proximity to whiteness, or when those folks gain whiteness. And then also for Latinos having to fit in as that in between of Black and white, and
Yes.
and where do we sit as a people?
I have a friend that says that we're la raza cósmica.
Yes,
Calls us the cosmic race.
that's another thing that I could probably talk about.
Which is kind of interesting. I'll have to research that.
Yeah, and Jeremy brings up a really good point too, that some say that it's changing over time due to that push for more pluralism, and that goes into the theory of the melting pot, right? And so I would rather I come from the viewpoint that assimilation serves a purpose. and it's largely a purpose of survival for me. And so I do find it really important for people of color and marginalized folks to have their own spaces and to not have to conform to what the United States has set up as our society, right? So that's just, that's kind of my viewpoint on that, that I'd rather say it's a salad than
That's what I call it.
hot. Yeah.
Ibu Patel, who's a famous interfaith thought leader, says he would prefer if we talk about a potluck instead of a melting pot, meaning that we all honor what we bring to the
Yes.
table.
Yes, yes. That's why I have used the salad analogy, because, you know, you taste all of the different flavors, and that's what makes it great. So it's appreciating that and not looking at difference as a problem.
Right.
You know, that's partly what happens. It's kind of, sometimes people feel uncomfortable if they're around others that aren't just like them.
Mhm.
You know, so a lot of times it's because it's a sense of being uncomfortable.
Right. And just like at the beginning of the presentation, I said, you know, this is the whole reason that Tri-Faith is around, is to connect us with people that are different than us, and that are often seen as the other. And that can take the form of racial differences, but also those religious differences. And often the combination of both, right? That, you know, just to bring it back in as to why was this conversation important for the Tri-Faith community, that's why.
That's great.
Any parting comments? Anybody?
I have a question. Is there some kind of innate something or other in humanity, in us as a human being, that sociologically we seek out likenesses like us? Like if you put a bunch of people in a room and you have to walk into a room with a bunch of people, don't you kind of seek out people maybe that are the same color as you, the same age, or some kind of identifying characteristic? Is there something innate in humanity that we seek out likenesses?
Yeah, so Jeremy, because I think that that's a combination between sociology and psychology. And so Jeremy's actually going to talk about that on the next one. So just a little teaser to leave you hanging there.
Thank you.
But I do think that there is something to that, yes.
There's a book that I actually had to read as part of my master's in social work called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Lunchroom?
Yeah. Yep. And just another personal connection to that is that I've had a particularly rough week dealing with whiteness and within the context of white supremacy. And today when I saw a friend of mine who happens to be biracial, the intense sigh of relief that I had when I saw her, right? That I just knew, like, oh, there's somebody who understands what I have lived through and what she has lived through and the things that we don't know about each other, right? But that we are safe for us to confide in those difficulties that we're facing every day.
Amanda, one thing that I find really interesting is my children, who are 19 and 21, were raised in a very diverse community.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they, and it may be just also other kids of their generation who grew up in a very diverse community. I know my son, like when he went to school at a new school in 6th grade, I walked into the room with him and I knew which kid he was going to connect with, and it wasn't the white kids. There was one child of mixed, and I'm like, that's who he was going for. And I knew that. He came home and he told me, and I said, I went with the curly hair, I picked him out for, you know. So I think there is something about the young, you know, a very young group of folks in our community that really don't see different things. And this is kind of a funny story with, so my son, although I'm pale, my son is very dark, like some of other of my family members. And in the summer we lived in California, he was always very, very dark. And one day he was in 4th grade, and his best friend, Peyton, who lived down the street, black, and they were sitting there, they'd been outside, they'd been swimming, and he said, "Mom, some kid at school said, 'Why'd you do that, white boy?' And he said, 'Why did he call me that?' And I said, 'Cause you're a white boy.' And he and Peyton looked at each other, and they put their arms up, and they were almost the same color. And they go, Sam goes, "Mom, I'm brown, you're white." And it was very, very interesting because they just, you know, and I realized how lucky we were to have grown up in this community that we did. But a lot of them really are seeing less of that. They're like, difference is cool. Like with my daughter, she loves people who are, you know, whatever it is. We live in Portland, so there's a lot of, you know, different. But that's what she's attracted to. And I think that's something that is just of this younger generation.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
I have seen that too. Yeah.
I'm going to include a report that it's not as obviously applicable to you because you're in Portland, but the PRRI did specifically around like race and religion in Nebraska. And it shows where people interact the most with people that are different than them. And so unsurprisingly, that's going to be places like schools for the most part. You know, we're getting back into that segregation based off of neighborhood and zip codes and funding, right? But like, you're still getting a more diverse pool as opposed to like religious spaces, right?
Yes. Well, and I do want to say that they grew up in Southern California.
Okay.
It's a very,
and also
Portland is very white. So just so you know.
Yeah.
And I live just across the river, actually, and it's in Washington. It's very, very white. So that's not what they grew up with. But yeah, but it was also our neighborhood. It was our school, it was our neighborhood. And interestingly, our temple didn't have a huge diversity, but we had diverse. We had Asian Jews, and we had Black Jews, and we had biracial Jews, as does my very, very small synagogue here in Southern Washington. Has quite, for a synagogue of 150 families, we're actually pretty diverse, which is unusual.
That's really good.
In our upcoming, or the class that is currently at the Jewish Day School here in Omaha is rather diverse as well. They did start allowing non-Jews into the program. However, there is a contingency of young Jews of color there that make me really excited and hopeful for the Omaha Jewish community. And, you know, I'm really trying to help pave and set those conversations for those kids so that they don't have to do as much of that internal diving and struggle and conflict that I have to do. So yeah. Jeremy posted the link for the survey in the chat twice. So really take it. Don't take it twice, but, you know, really take it. And let us know how this went. If you found it interesting, if you don't want to hear from me again, if you do, just give us all of your feedback, and we really do take it to heart.
Thank you, Amanda. Great job.
Oh, I lost you guys.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Amanda.